All right, so why are we even talking about Viking funerals in 2025? It turns out these ancient death rituals give us a window into how people understand life, death, and the afterlife. Viking funerals weren't just dramatic, they were deeply symbolic. They remind us that honoring the dead is a universal human tradition that crosses culture and time periods. According to historian Amber Winroth, in The Age of the Vikings, funeral customs were central to Viking identity and reflected how they saw the world, not just death. So even though we're not setting ships on fire anymore, the way we ritualize loss and remember loved ones, that hasn't changed much at all.
Even though flaming boats is a bit dramatic, it can still provide a sense of closure to families. This is because it's one last final goodbye in their spirit heading to Valhalla, which is what they believe in. It also provides support to the grieving family. Since this is a public viewing, the community comes in, provides support for the family, and it can also strengthen bonds within the community.
As future funeral professionals, looking back at Viking funerals helps us understand the roots of what we do, both the meaningful parts and the cautionary ones. Their ceremonies weren't just about disposing of a body, they were about honoring life and preparing someone for the afterlife. But they also had some intense practices we obviously don't carry forward today. For example, according to the Arab traveler Ibn Fadlan, when a chieftain died, a slave girl volunteered or was chosen to be ritually sacrificed and burned on the pyre with him. His account, as translated in Mission to the Volga by J.E. Montgomery in 2017, describes her being given drugs, paraded, and then ultimately killed and placed beside the chief before the pyre was lit. It's a chilling part of history, but it also shows how cultural beliefs can shape what people think is honorable or necessary.
So, what does it teach us for today as future funeral directors? It teaches us personalization. Personalization meaning we see that shift away from traditional funerals, and most people have put more of a focus on personalized funerals for the deceased. It also teaches us that even though there are many different religions, most people have a belief of an afterlife, and that Valhalla, for example, it still teaches us an example of when we're moving our spirits when we die, that we have an afterlife.
Today we have strict ethical standards for a reason. That contrast helps us appreciate how far funeral service has come and why dignity and consent are at the heart of what we do now. Their belief in places like Valhalla and Hell also show how culture influences grief. Valhalla was kind of like a warrior heaven, where the brave went to feast and fight forever. Hell, on the other hand, wasn't a punishment, just a quiet afterlife for folks who died of sickness or old age. Knowing these beliefs helps us better serve families with diverse backgrounds today. Viking funerals may seem like ancient history, but they've left a surprisingly modern legacy. Their ceremonies emphasized who a person was in life, which is something we try to reflect in memorials today.
The Vikings left a legacy that has an impact on today's funeral industry. I provided two examples. Um, that would be when a Viking member would pass, and this is only including on Vikings that were not in the upper class. The family would carve ships into stones, thus giving us an impact on today's ideas of personalized headstones, footstones, etc. My second example is in Viking history, on the seventh day, people would celebrate what was called the shod, which is a word for funeral ale and the feast, and that typically represents the reading of the will, as well as celebrating after funerals, like traditionally people do food after funerals to gather and eat.
Harold King, in his book Death and Memory in Early Medieval Britain, points out that Viking graves weren't just practical, they were symbolic. The items placed with the dead helped tell their story. Sound familiar? That's personalization, and it's still one of the biggest trends in funeral service now. The transition from Norse paganism to Christianity also helped shape Western burial traditions, including the emphasis on burial over cremation, until, of course, cremation made its comeback centuries later. We're focusing on the Viking Age, which lasted roughly from 793 to 1066 AD. This was a time when Norse people were sailing, trading, raiding, and exploring all over Europe. During this era, funeral practices varied based on status, religion, and belief. Some were cremated on ships, others were buried in elaborate mounds with their belongings, and sometimes even with sacrificed animals or servants. As Christianity spread through Scandinavia, these traditions began to change. People moved away from ship burials and toward Christian-style cemeteries. Still, many of the old customs blended into the new faith, creating unique funeral practices that influenced European ritual for centuries.
So there are a few Viking customs that still do apply today in the funeral industry. In Viking customs, the deceased was draped in new clothes, and today people either buy new clothes or bring whatever was symbolic to the deceased. There was a ceremony held as well, whether it be flaming or just a little ceremony. And today, ceremonies are traditionally held in churches, chapels, anywhere in the home, really anywhere. The ceremony in Viking customs, they featured chants and songs, and today ceremonies typically include songs of whether it be the person's favorite song, or whatever. In Viking custom, food and alcohol was served. I feel like maybe today alcohol would be a little taboo, but food is typically served so that the grieving family is surrounded by loved ones. Gifts were also brought. They were known as grave goods. And today people typically buy flowers and bring foods to the families as gifts.
There are a few key people we have to thank for what we know about Viking funerals. First is Ibn Fadlan, a 10th century Arab traveler who actually witnessed a Viking funeral and wrote a vivid, kind of gruesome account of it. According to Mission to the Volga by J.E. Montgomery, his description remains one of the most important historical sources on Viking death rituals. There's also Queen Asa, whose burial in the Oseberg ship is one of the most elaborate ever discovered. Her grave showed that women could hold serious power and status in Viking society. Harold Bluetooth, fun fact, the guy our Bluetooth tech is named after, helped transition Vikings from pagan to Christian practices which changed the way people were buried.
As we close today, to make this a little fun, I want to explain 3 facts or fun facts that you didn't know about Viking funerals. Typically, the ship burials were only for upper class Norsemen. They didn't really take place in the lower classes. Fact number two, when a ship burial wasn't taking place, the Vikings would still cremate. However, the fire that they used to cremate was set so high so that the deceased spirit could boost and reach to the heavens. And number 3, when a Viking was buried, they would place stones around the ground to represent an outline of the ship.
There's a lot of good pieces of information to take away from the Vikings, and a lot of stuff that is probably best left behind us, like burning people alive in pyres. Thanks, y'all.